The beast dropped its head into his lap and purred. That was the part nobody could explain afterward. Not the ignored control codes, not the security team frozen in the doorway with their dispersers raised and their orders suddenly useless. Not even Professor Tharn's voice cracking mid-sentence, which, by all accounts, had never happened before in 17 years of teaching. Just the purring. Hal Kren had his good hand flat on the desk, his injured arm wedged tight in its sling, and somewhere in the back of his mind, he was running a very short list of things he could do. The list was not encouraging. 800 pounds of bioengineered predator had its skull in his lap. Its breath came warm and steady through the gap between his knee and the edge of the desk. Its eyes were closed. Everyone else in the Meridian Hall had stopped breathing. Tharn stood 3 rows forward, 6 limbs locked at his sides, metallic bands catching the lecture light. His control brace was active. The green pulse that meant compliance still fired every 3 seconds, right on schedule. The Virnax simply was not listening. Cadet, the professor's translator, rapped the word like a scalpel. Do not move. Hal looked down at the creature's broad skull resting across his thighs. Then he looked up at Tharn. I'm not moving, Hal said. She is. Stay close. The part that explains why she chose him, that comes next. 3 weeks earlier, the Meridian Hall had been exactly what it was supposed to be. That meant cold, for one thing. The atmospheric regulation on level 7 kept the air at a temperature that suited the majority species in the room, which did not include humans. Hal had learned in his first week to layer under the standard cadet uniform a thin thermal base, nothing visible, nothing that would draw attention from the wrong quarter. He was good at not drawing attention. He was less good at injuries. The left shoulder had happened during a cross-discipline simulation 6 days before the semester started. A stray pressure burst from a malfunctioning pneumatic arm, a brief window of very bad luck, and a clean fracture that the medbay had set and wrapped and pronounced healing on schedule. The structured sling held the arm at a fixed angle, the strap worn to fraying at the buckle from constant adjustment, the fabric already stained faint yellow from the antiseptic the medtech reapplied every other morning. It was not a dramatic injury. It was just always there, in the way. Hal had developed the habit of adjusting it without thinking, a small tug on the strap when he sat, a shift of weight away from the left when he stood. His hand hovered near the buckle in any crowded room, not defensively, just aware. He arrived late to Tharn's first lecture because the campus transit pod from the medbay ran 4 minutes behind. He came in through the rear entrance. The last available seat was on the far left of the back row, which put him between a Zorathy student who had built a small wall of annotated data pads around herself and an empty stretch of bench that, he would later understand, students had learned to leave empty on purpose. He did not know that yet. He sat down. The hall was enormous. The Meridian Hall occupied the central spine of the Interstellar Academy's main tower, high vaulted ceiling, 17 rows of curved seating, a lecture floor wide enough to hold a small spacecraft if you cleared the display rigs. The light was the particular flat white of academic spaces, the kind that made everything look simultaneously important and slightly unwell. Hal set his cracked holopad on the desk and plugged in. Down on the lecture floor, Professor Tharn was already talking. He was tall for a Dominion-certified educator, 6 limbs in motion, the dull green of his carapace picking up the overhead light and giving it back harder. The metallic bands at his midsection marked academic rank, 3 full bands and 1 partial, which meant he had been doing this long enough to have stopped caring how it looked. His translator emitted in the mid-register, the frequency that carried through a large room without distortion, and the words came out shaped like a reprimand, even when they were not. Obedience, Tharn said, is not a concept, it is a practice, and like all practices, it requires correction to become habit. Beside him, the Virnax moved. Hal had not noticed it at first. His attention had been on the holopad connection, which kept dropping. But when the thing crossed into the light, it was impossible to miss. It was the size of a large ground vehicle, low to the floor, six-limbed in the way that predators on 3 different planets had independently converged on because it worked. Its coat was the blue-gray of deep water, each strand of it slightly reflective, so that it seemed to shift as it moved. Its eyes were the pale gold of old glass. It paced between the rows with the slow, measured attention of something that had learned to wait. A Trinolite student 2 rows ahead of Hal made a soft, high sound, not a word, just pressure escaping, and went absolutely still. The Zorathy beside Hal had not moved since the Virnax entered the floor. No one was taking notes. No one was checking their pads. Tharn did not look at the creature. He did not need to. The effect was already working. Obedience in a diplomatic context, he continued, is the first tool, not negotiation, not principle, obedience. You will find that most of what this curriculum teaches traces back to this foundation. The Virnax paused in the 4th row. Its head turned. The pale gold eyes tracked left, then right, cataloguing. The student it had stopped beside, a Syraxian, quiet-voiced, sitting very straight, did not move, but Hal could see the tendons in her neck go rigid from where he was sitting. The creature moved on. Hal's good hand had drifted without his noticing to the strap of his sling. He registered it, made himself put his hand flat on the desk, and went back to his holopad. The Virnax is a product of Dominion enforcement sciences, Tharn said, and for the first time his tone carried something almost like satisfaction. Engineered for behavioral compliance, responsive to registration codes, not domesticated, calibrated. The distinction matters. Domesticated animals can be reasoned with. Calibrated ones simply perform the function they were designed for. The creature turned at the end of the 3rd row and began the return pass. Hal thought, I really hope it doesn't drool. The thought was immediate and absurd, and he almost smiled, which would have been the wrong moment for it. He kept his face neutral and watched the Virnax pace back toward the front. It stopped. The room had been very quiet before. Now it was the kind of quiet that happens when every organism in a space decides simultaneously that being still is the only correct choice. The Virnax was at the intersection of the 3rd and 4th rows, which put it roughly 20 meters from the back of the hall, and its head had turned. It was looking at Hal. Not the way it had looked at the Syraxian student, a passing catalogue, threat assessment, move on. This was different. The gold eyes held, and the creature's weight shifted very slightly, the front limbs settling. It was not preparing to attack. It was deciding something. Tharn said, Cadet Kren, stop moving. Hal looked at his hands. They were flat on the desk. He had not moved. The Virnax took one step toward the back of the room. Then another. Tharn's hand went to the control brace. The green pulse fired. 1, 2, 3. The creature's head moved in the direction of the signal, a reflex, and then it turned away from the signal and kept walking. Nobody in the Meridian Hall made a sound. Hal watched the Virnax come up the center aisle. It was larger than it had looked from the floor. The ceiling at the back of the hall was lower, and the creature's shoulder blades nearly brushed the overhead panel as it passed beneath it. Its footfalls were almost silent, just a faint shift of air each time a limb set down. It stopped at his row. Hal had a single thought, very clear. If I stay absolutely still, I will find out what happens next. He stayed absolutely still. The Virnax stepped sideways into his row, moving past the Zorathy's wall of data pads, which collapsed immediately as the student pressed herself flat against the far wall. And it came to Hal's seat, and it lowered its enormous head and laid it across his thighs. The purring started about 3 seconds later. It was deep and steady, like something mechanical running correctly. The weight of the creature's skull was significant. Hal's injured shoulder sent a warning signal as his whole posture adjusted to compensate, but he did not move. He looked down at the pale gold eyes, now closed. He looked up at the room. The security team had arrived, which meant someone had triggered the alert from somewhere in the last 90 seconds. 4 of them stood in the main entrance with dispersers at half raise. and they were all looking at their team leader, who was looking at Professor Tharn, who was looking at Hal with an expression that did not have a clean translation. "I didn't do anything," Hal said, to no one in particular. "Cadet," Tharn's voice had changed. The scalpel was still there, but something had moved behind it. "You will instruct the animal to return." "I don't know how to do that." "You will learn quickly." Hal looked down again at the sleeping predator. The purring had settled into a rhythm, steady and unhurried. "She seems pretty comfortable," he said. "I don't want to rush it." Nobody moved for a long time. The dispersers stayed at half raise. Tharn stood very still on the lecture floor, his control brace firing its green pulse every 3 seconds into a creature that had stopped caring. The hall smelled of recycled air and the faint mineral bite of the overhead lights, and under that, something warmer, the Virnax's breath, steady and slow against Hal's knee. Hal kept his hand flat on the desk. The security team leader, a broad-shouldered Arillari, translucent skin catching the light, finally moved. She crossed 3 steps toward the back row and stopped when the Virnax's purring changed pitch. Not louder, just different. A lower frequency, a warning in a register that required no translation. The team leader stopped. She looked at Hal. "Can you move it?" she said. "I don't think I should try," Hal said. "Can you stand up?" Hal considered the 800 pounds of skull in his lap. "Not really, no." She looked at the dispersers in her team's hands. She looked at the creature. She made a decision that was clearly uncomfortable and stepped back. Tharn had come up the center aisle while this was happening, and now he stood at the end of Hal's row, 6 limbs held with the rigid precision of someone who was furious and had decided to perform being calm instead. His mandibles moved at the edges, a small twitch he was not controlling. "This animal," Tharn said, "responds to registered codes. You are interfering with a calibrated enforcement system, whatever you have done." "I sat down," Hal said. "Whatever you have done to provoke this response." "Professor," the security team leader's voice was careful. "The compliance codes are still active." Tharn looked at his control brace. The green pulse fired. The Virnax shifted its head slightly, pressed it more firmly into Hal's lap, and kept purring. "That," Hal said, "is not a compliance response." Tharn's mandibles stopped twitching. His eyes, compound and faceted, fixed on Hal with an expression that promised a specific kind of future trouble. Then he turned and walked out of the Meridian Hall. The door sealed behind him with a soft, final click. The room stayed frozen for another 10 seconds. Then, one by one, the other students left. The Trinolite first, moving fast and low, then the Syraxian, then a cluster of Skarn who had been sitting together in the middle rows and who left in the particular formation of people who want to look calm while moving at maximum speed. The Zorathy paused to gather her data pads from where they had scattered, stacked them with methodical care, and departed without making eye contact with anyone. Hal was alone in the Meridian Hall with 4 security personnel and an apex predator asleep in his lap. "So," he said, to no one in particular, "what happens now?" The team leader checked her comm unit. "Dean Salvi is reviewing the lecture footage," she said. "We wait." Hal looked down at the Virnax. Her breathing was deep and even. One of her forelimbs had shifted so the weight of it rested against the side of his chair, a warm pressure along his ankle. "I'm going to need water at some point," he said. Nobody answered. Dean Salvi's office was on the 14th floor of the Academy's administrative tower, and it had 3 translucent walls, which meant that anyone inside it could be seen from the corridor, which meant that Hal had an audience as he sat across the desk from the most senior administrator in the building and tried to explain what had happened. The Virnax sat beside him. The dean was an Arillari, jelly-fingered, unhurried, with the long-limbed stillness of someone who had mediated enough crises to have stopped performing urgency. She watched the creature the way you watch a large fire, with respect, with distance, without looking away. "Walk me through it," she said. "I arrived late," Hal said. I sat down in the last available seat. The Virnax walked up the aisle and lay down. I have not done anything to her. You called her, the dean said. Hal paused. I did. That is not a behavioral designation. It's a pronoun, Hal said. I defaulted. Dean Salvi folded two of her 4 hands together on the desk. The lecture footage confirms your account. The compliance system was active throughout. There is no record of any contact between you and the animal prior to the moment she approached your row. She was quiet for a moment. This puts me in a very specific kind of difficulty. How specific? Hal said. There are 3 charter violations pending, the dean said. 5 peaceful presence clauses invoked. The Predatory Species Act requires an incident report filed within 6 hours, a behavioral review within 48, and a containment assessment within 72. She looked at the Virnax, who had settled onto the floor beside Hal's chair with her head resting on her forelimbs. None of those processes account for the possibility that the animal is currently non-hostile. She hasn't threatened anyone, Hal said. She changed pitch at a security officer. She didn't move. The dean looked at him for a moment. You are very calm about this. I'm a diplomatic cadet, Hal said. I'm supposed to be calm about things. Most diplomatic cadets would have attempted to leave the seat. The seat was available, Hal said. I was late. Dean Salvi uncoupled her hands. She tapped twice on the embedded console in the surface of her desk. Professor Tharn has requested the animal's immediate return to the Enforcement Sciences Division for reconditioning. Hal said nothing. I have declined that request, the dean said, on the grounds that reconditioning requires first establishing what behavioral pattern was triggered. We do not yet know what she responded to. She looked at Hal. You will remain on campus and available for assessment. The animal will not be separated from you until we understand what this is. Okay, Hal said. You understand that this is not a choice, the dean said. This is an administrative determination. I understand, Hal said. I'm not arguing. The Virnax had shifted her head so her chin rested at the exact point where the leg of Hal's chair met the floor. Her breathing had slowed. She'll need feeding, Hal said. The dean looked at him for a very long moment. I will have the Enforcement Sciences kitchen roster transferred to your unit, she said. The forms took most of the afternoon. 72 liability waivers, an incident declaration in triplicate, a custodianship waiver that ran to 11 sections, and a behavioral registry addendum that required Hal to describe the animal's temperament in terms that the form had clearly not been designed for. He wrote, calm, alert, non-threatening toward this cadet in the relevant field, and left the rest of the section blank. His bunkmate, Vilix, was waiting outside the admin office when Hal emerged. Vilix was scarn, 4-eyed, built broad, and operated on a philosophy of cheerful pragmatism that had served him well across 4 years of academy life. He looked at the Virnax. The Virnax looked at him. Vilix looked at Hal. That's yours now, he said. Administratively, Hal said. Right. Vilix's 4 eyes moved between the creature and Hal twice. So here's the thing. I've been thinking about the dorm situation, and I've realized I've always wanted to try the single occupancy quarters on level 6. It's been a long time coming, honestly. Vilix. It's purely about personal growth, Vilix said. Nothing to do with this at all. He picked up his bag from the floor beside the doorframe where it was already packed. He gave Hal one long, sincere look. Don't let her eat my pillow. She can't reach your bunk, Hal said. That seems like something a person would say right before she reaches the bunk, Vilix said, and left. The next 3 days established a new shape to Hal's life. The Virnax followed him everywhere. That was the first thing. Not at his heel like a trained animal, she moved on her own schedule, a few meters back, and the distance she maintained was consistent. Close enough to intervene, far enough to survey. She stopped when he stopped. She waited outside every door he entered. and when he emerged, she fell in behind him with the quiet certainty of something that had already decided this arrangement was correct. The second thing was the shoulder. Hal had never had anyone react to his injury with any particular attention. The medtech noted it. Tharn had mentioned it exactly once dismissively in the context of full physical requirements for simulation work. Nobody else had seemed to register it. The Virnax, for reasons Hal could not explain, had decided it was significant. Whenever anyone came near Hal, a student in the corridor, a passing administrator, a delivery drone that drifted too close, she moved, not aggressively. She simply put herself between the approaching thing and Hal's left side. A shift of weight, a positioning, and she stayed there until the thing had passed. She did not growl. She did not have to. 3 different students had attempted to approach Hal in the first 2 days. All 3 had pulled up short when the Virnax repositioned, reassessed what they were doing, and found somewhere else to be. "She doesn't like when you flinch," said Dr. Krelix, on the 4th day, from the other side of reinforced glass. Dr. Krelix was Lan, tall, long-fingered, with the particular stillness of someone who spent most of their time watching rather than participating. She was a new ethologist, brought in from the Academy's research division, because no one in behavioral management had a working theory for what had happened in the Meridian Hall. She had spent 3 sessions behind the glass, taking notes on a flat slate, saying very little. "I don't flinch," Hal said. "You adjust the sling strap when someone approaches your left side," Krelix said. From her sensory profile, that reads as a pain signal. Hal looked down at his hand. It was on the strap. He moved it. "What does that mean?" he said. "It means she has mapped your stress del," Krelix said. "Her positioning behavior isn't threat response, it's preemptive." She tapped something on her slate. The creature was engineered for enforcement. She should not have imprinted. The calibration is supposed to prevent it. She looked up. It did not prevent it. "Why not?" Hal said. Krelix was quiet for a moment. "Earth mammals," she said, "have highly interactive care-bonding habits. It is possible your behavior, the injury, the adjustment, the stillness under stress, reads as a calming signal to her new sensory profile. You were not afraid of her. You were in pain. That combination may not exist in her prior experience." Hal processed this. So she bonded with me because I was hurt and didn't run. "Inconclusive," Krelix said, "but highly reproducible." Hal looked at the Virnax, who was sitting beside his chair with her chin level with his shoulder. She had not looked at Krelix once during the conversation. "She's not a weapon anymore, is she?" Hal said. It was not quite a question. Krelix set down her slate. "She is a Dominion enforcement asset," she said carefully. "The reclassification process would require substantial documentation." She did not say no. The Dominion enforcement agent arrived on the 7th day, and he was not subtle about it. His name was something long and Dominion formatted that the translator rendered as Agent Voss. He was large for his species, broad in the chest, with the particular bearing of someone who had spent years being the thing in the room that other things were afraid of. He crossed the Academy quad with 2 aides and a transfer authorization sealed in a case, and he was smiling when he found Hal near the east entrance. "Cadet Kren," he said, "this process should take under 10 minutes. The asset will be returned to Enforcement Sciences by—" The Virnax rose from her rest position beside Hal. She did not make a sound. She simply stood up, all her weight shifting forward, her pale gold eyes fixed on the agent, and the agent stopped talking. He looked at the creature. He looked at the transfer case in his aide's hands. He looked at the creature again. The smile had gone somewhere else. "She goes with me," Hal said. Voss looked at him. His bearing had changed, still professional, but recalibrated, with the particular quality of someone doing rapid mental arithmetic. "The transfer authorization is fully compliant with." "She goes with me," Hal said again. The Virnax had not moved. She was watching the agent with the patient, specific attention of something that has already made a decision and is waiting to see if it becomes necessary. Voss looked at his aides. Then he looked at the sealed case. Then he looked at the Virnax one more time, and something shifted in his calculation. "I'll need to file a compliance objection," he said. "File it," Hal said. "She still goes with me." The agent sealed the case, turned, and walked back across the quad at a pace that was technically unhurried and practically very fast. Hal stood in the morning light with 800 pounds of bonded predator at his side, watching the Dominion representative cross the Academy grounds and wondering how many more compliance objections were coming. The Virnax pressed her head briefly against his right side, the good shoulder, and then settled back to her usual position, watchful, steady, already scanning the next approach. Whatever she was now, she was not returning. The compliance objection arrived before breakfast. Hal found it on his unit's comm panel, filed overnight, stamped with a Dominion enforcement seal that rendered in deep red and took up most of the screen. The objection cited 4 sections of the Predatory Species Act, 2 subsections of the Interstellar Transfer Authority Guidelines, and 1 procedural clause that Hal had to read 3 times before he understood it was essentially arguing that a cadet could not legally refuse a transfer order on the grounds of animal preference. He read it standing at the panel in his empty room, the Virnax behind him, her chin on his good shoulder. "They want you back," he said. She breathed against his neck, warm and steady. "Yeah," he said, "me too." He closed the objection and went to find the Dean. Dean Salvi did not look surprised to see him. She gestured to the seat across her desk without looking up from her own screen, waited until Hal had sat down, and then turned the display toward him. "I have read it," Hal said. "Then you know what it means," she said. "It means they can override the custodianship waiver if I can't establish a legally recognized bond within the review period." Hal kept his voice even. "How long is the review period?" 30 days from the date of the initial incident, the Dean said. "We're at day 7. "Yes." Hal looked at the Virnax, who had settled beside the office door. "What does a legally recognized bond look like?" The Dean set down the screen. "For a Type 3 sentience designation, you would need behavioral documentation, a neuroethological assessment recommending reclassification, and a Senate committee review." She paused. "The documentation and assessment are achievable. The Senate review takes time we may not have." "How much time?" "Longer than 23 days. Hal was quiet for a moment. Across the office, the Virnax watched him with her pale gold eyes. Outside the translucent walls, 2 junior administrators had slowed to look, and then, noticing they were visible, had walked faster. "What happens if we lose the review period?" he said. The Dean met his eyes. "They take her." The words sat in the air between them. "Then we start the documentation today," Hal said. Dr. Krelix had not expected to see Hal at her research unit that morning, but she did not look displeased. She pulled up the behavioral files she had been building since the first session, turned her slate toward him, and began walking through what she had. The data was specific. The Virnax's proximity patterns had shifted completely. In her prior enforcement sciences record, she maintained a functional distance from all registered handlers, close enough for command response, far enough to stay operational. Since the Meridian Hall incident, she had compressed that distance to less than 2 meters from Hal at all times, extended it only when Hal signaled he was secure, and returned to baseline the moment his stress del appeared. "The stress del is the sling adjustment," Krelix said. "You do it without thinking. She responds without thinking. The loop is automatic." "So the bond is a reflex," Hal said. "The bond is real," Krelix said carefully. "The reflex is just how it started." She tapped through to another section. "I have enough here for the behavioral documentation. What I need is more time with the positioning data, specifically the protective behavior. I've seen it in the corridor records, but I need a controlled observation." Hal thought about Voss, about the sealed case, about 23 days. "How do we get you the positioning data?" he said. "A simulation environment," Krelix said. Cross-discipline. Something with unpredictable variables, so the protective response triggers naturally rather than on cue. I'm scheduled for a simulation with Eltruin in 3 days, Hal said. Cross-governance scenario. Multiple moving elements. Krelix looked at him. You would bring her into a live simulation. She follows me everywhere, Hal said. I don't think I have a choice. The next days had a specific rhythm to them. Mornings in the documentation sessions with Krelix, afternoons in the modified simulation prep that now had to account for an extra participant who was not in the course catalogue. Eltruin, the Syraxian student, quiet-voiced, careful, had agreed to the shared simulation, and Hal had been honest with her about why. She won't hurt you, he said. I know, Eltruin said, with the tone of someone who was working hard to believe this. She stays near me. She doesn't engage with anyone who isn't moving toward my left side. What if I move toward your left side by accident? Don't do that, Hal said. Eltruin had nodded, slowly, with the expression of someone adding a new rule to a list that was getting long. The evenings were quieter. Hal worked at his desk, and the Virnax lay behind him, her breathing the background to everything. The room was empty of Vilix's noise, the clutter of his study materials, the four-eyed running commentary on academy politics that had made the dorm feel larger than it was. Now it was just Hal and the creature, and the comm panel with its waiting red seal, and the sling hung on the hook by the door where the medtech had told him to keep it when he wasn't wearing it to sleep. He thought about what Krelix had said, about what she had not said. She had not said the Virnax was dangerous. She had not said the bond was a malfunction, exactly. She had used words like highly reproducible and strongly documented and compelling behavioral precedent. These were words that meant something in an assessment report. Whether they meant enough was a different question. On the 11th day, he started calling her Kova. It was not a decision, he announced. It happened in the morning when she pressed her head against his right shoulder before he'd finished his coffee, and he said, without thinking, "Good morning, Kova." She lifted her head and looked at him. He said it again. Her ears, the flat, wide plates along the side of her skull, shifted forward. She held that position for a moment, then lay back down. He used the name again at the end of the documentation session, and again when he came back to the room that night. By the second day of it, she was responding consistently, not to any other sound in that frequency range, just to the name. Krelix noted it in the behavioral file without comment, and then wrote 3 additional lines, and then said, "That's significant." Why? Hal said. Name recognition in an enforcement-calibrated predator indicates preference-based attention, she said, not command response. She is not responding to a control code. She is responding to you. She looked up from the slate. That is the strongest piece of evidence we have for Type 3 designation. Hal sat with that for a moment. An old word, he said. Kova, it means shelter, roughly, in an old Earth language. Krelix wrote it down. That will go in the report. The simulation was scheduled for the 14th day. It was a cross-governance scenario, the kind that the Academy used to test how students from different diplomatic traditions handled the same unresolved crisis. Hal and Eltruin had been assigned a resource arbitration case, 3 competing claims, a ticking procedural deadline. The simulation room ran it in real time, pulling from a shared scenario database, introducing variables as the session went on. Hal had been through a dozen of these. He knew the pattern, an early, easy move to establish roles, a mid-session complication designed to force a choice under pressure, a final variable that tested whether the solution held. Standard structure. He was not nervous about it. He was mildly nervous about Kova. She had been in the simulation prep room twice during the documentation sessions, and she had been fine, alert, positioned, watching the door. But the scenario room itself was larger, with more moving elements, and the variables were, by design, unpredictable. Eltruin arrived early and stood near the center of the room with the posture of someone who had decided to be brave about this and was managing it adequately. Kova entered behind Hal, and took a position along the left wall, low, her chin resting on her forelimbs. Her gold eyes moved through the room in a single methodical pass, cataloguing, and then settled. "She's fine," Hal said. "Absolutely," Eltruin said, in a voice that suggested she was saving her opinion for later. The scenario loaded. The first variable dropped in, a disputed filing, 3 parties, 1 deadline. Hal pulled up the case display and started working. Eltruin took the secondary position, cross-referencing the claim documents. They worked well. Eltruin was precise and fast, and Hal had learned in the prep sessions that she caught procedural errors he missed. They were 40 minutes in when the second variable hit. The scenario system introduced a filing dispute that came with a physical prop, a case file set, loaded into the room's document distributor. The distributor ran the files to both positions, and Hal's set arrived with a malfunction in the delivery arm. The case file hit the edge of his desk wrong, clipped the corner, and a section of it caught him on the left shoulder. The pain was immediate and specific, not sharp enough to be damage, but enough to make his breath pull short and his hand go to the sling strap without thinking. The room changed. He heard it before he saw it, a low-frequency shift in the air, something below the threshold of language. When he looked up, Kova was standing. She had moved from the wall to a position between Hal and the document distributor in what felt like a single step, though he had not seen her move. She was not attacking. She was not making noise. She was standing in a perfect arc between him and the source of the impact, her weight forward, her eyes on the machine, and the quality of her stillness was the specific quality of something that has decided what it will do if the situation asks it to. Eltruin had pressed herself flat against the far wall. The simulation had paused. He had not paused it. The room's environmental sensors had detected an anomaly and stopped the scenario automatically. Hal's shoulder was blazing quietly. His hand was still on the strap. He looked at Kova at the line of her back, the absolute steadiness of her position, and he said very quietly, "Down." She looked at him. The gold eyes held his for a long moment. She lay down, still between him and the distributor, still watching it, still ready. The room was very quiet. Eltruin from the wall said in a small voice, did she just?" "Yeah," Hal said. "She protected you from a filing machine." "The machine hit me," Hal said. She responded. "That was not a threat." "She didn't know that," Hal said, and looked at Kova again. "She saw me flinch." Krelix reviewed the simulation footage that evening and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I have everything I need for the assessment report." "Will it be enough?" Hal said. Krelix turned her slate toward him. The footage was paused on the moment, Kova mid-rise, the protective arc perfect, the decision already made before Hal had finished flinching. "She placed herself between a perceived threat and your injury," Krelix said. "Not her handler, not a registered authority. You, by name, by position, by pain signature." She set the slate down. "The documentation is complete. The assessment will recommend Type 3 sentience designation. What happens after that is not in my hands." "The Senate review," Hal said. "Yes." Hal looked at the paused footage. Kova, suspended in the moment of choosing, not attacking, not performing, just standing between him and the thing that had hurt him, waiting to see if it would try again. "How long do we have before the Dominion enforcement window closes?" he said. 9 days, Krelix said. Hal stood up. "Then we need the Senate review to move faster than it wants to." He walked to the door. Kova rose from her place beside the desk and fell in behind him, a few meters back, steady as a tide. He had 9 days. The Senate liaison office did not answer on the first day. Or the second. On the third day, Hal walked to the Academy's Administrative Comm Center, found the direct channel for the Interstellar Senate's Diplomatic Sciences Oversight Committee, and sent a formal request for expedited review. He wrote it himself, without help from the Dean's office, in plain language that said, "The documentation is complete. The assessment is filed, the window closes in 6 days, and a legally recognized bond is being held hostage to a procedural timeline that was designed for cases with no urgency. He pressed send and went back to his room. Kova was waiting by the door. She had started doing this, positioning at the threshold when he left for short runs, turning to face him as he returned, the gold eyes tracking his posture before he'd finished crossing the room. He had learned to stand straight when he came in, not because she needed the performance, but because she noticed everything, and he had gotten careful about what he showed her without meaning to. He sat at his desk. She lay down behind him. He opened his holopad and started preparing the secondary documentation Krelix had suggested, a behavioral timeline, event by event, from the Meridian Hall forward. Not for the Senate, for the record. Because Krelix had said once quietly that records mattered more than reviews, and Hal had written it down. He worked for 2 hours. When he looked up, the light outside had shifted. He had printed it on paper, the way his training instructor had taught him in his first semester. Any document you might need to prove existed should exist in a form no system can lock. He filed it in the physical drawer under his desk, the old one with the stuck runner that he'd never fixed, and he did not think about why. The response from the Senate liaison came on day 5. It was not an approval. It was a request for additional documentation. Specifically, a secondary behavioral assessment from a non-academy source, which meant a Dominion-affiliated research body, which meant a process that could take weeks Hal did not have. He read it standing at the comm panel, and he was still reading it when the dean arrived at his door. She had read it too. "There is a clause," she said, before he could speak. "In the Predatory Species Act, Section 9, a provisional recognition can be filed if the bond meets the criteria for Type 3 designation and the primary evaluator certifies imminent separation risk." Krelix would sign that, Hal said. "She already has," the dean said. "I asked her this morning." Hal looked at her. She stood in the doorway with the careful stillness of someone who had made a decision they were not certain was strictly within their authority, and had made it anyway. "A provisional recognition buys time," she said. "It does not close the Senate review, but it suspends the Dominion transfer window pending final ruling." "How long does it suspend it?" "Long enough," the dean said. Kova had risen from her position behind Hal. She crossed the room and stood beside him, and the dean looked at her, at the gold eyes, the quiet weight of her, the way she positioned herself at his left, and for a moment her long-limbed Arillari stillness dropped into something closer to plain feeling. "File it," Hal said. The provisional recognition came through in 48 hours. Voss returned on the morning it was filed, with a sealed case and 2 additional aides and an expression that suggested he had spent the night preparing for a clean transfer. He found Hal on the quad again, the same east entrance, the same morning light, and this time he did not smile. "Cadet Kren," he said, "the transfer window has been suspended," Hal said. "Check your comm." Voss checked his comm. His face did not change in any dramatic way. It simply went through a series of small adjustments, the kind that happen when a person recalibrates quickly and professionally and does not want to show that they needed to. "The provisional recognition is a procedural delay," he said. "It does not constitute a permanent." "I know what it is," Hal said. "It's time." Kova was beside him, her weight forward, her eyes on Voss. Not threatening, waiting. Voss looked at her. He looked at the case. He looked at Hal. "You've turned a Dominion enforcement asset," he said, "into a companion animal." "She turned herself into one," Hal said. "I just stayed in the seat." Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he closed the case, tucked it under his arm, and left. This time, Hal thought, he might not come back. The Senate review moved. Not fast. Nothing about Senate committee processes moved fast, but it moved. Krelix's assessment report went in with the provisional filing, and the behavioral timeline Hal had built went in alongside it. and the dean submitted a formal institutional endorsement that, she told him later, had taken most of a night to word correctly. 3 weeks after the Meridian Hall incident, Tharn was quietly transferred to the Dominion Military Academy, where, by all accounts, students did not question him and the compliance tools worked as intended. Nobody announced it. His name simply stopped appearing on the course roster, and a different educator took over the Enforcement Sciences seminar. Hal heard about it from Eltruin, who had heard it from the administrative assistant who managed the Level 7 classroom assignments. He filed the information, said nothing, and went back to the documentation. Kova pressed her head against his right shoulder that morning for longer than usual. He did not know if she understood what had shifted. He thought, sometimes, that she understood more than understanding required words for. She had stopped scanning the corridor outside the dean's office. She had started sleeping more deeply in the evenings. Small things, a loosening. The formal reclassification came on a Tuesday. Hal was in the academy's common room, working at one of the long tables near the east window when his comm panel chimed. Kova was under the table, which she had started doing in public spaces, less visible, closer, the specific behavior of something that had learned it was safer to be unnoticed. He checked the comm. The subject line read, Reclassification, Bonded Companion, Type 3 Sentience Designation, Recognized. He read it twice. Then he set the comm face down on the table. He reached under the table and put his hand on Kova's head. She shifted, a small press of her skull against his palm, warm and steady. "It's done," he said quietly. She did not respond to the words. She responded to whatever she read in him, the posture shift, the breath change, the absence of the particular tension she had been tracking for weeks. Her ears moved forward. She settled more fully, the weight of her spreading, the low purr starting in her chest like something unclenching. He sat there for a while, his hand on her head, the reclassification document face down on the table, and did not say anything else. The seminar happened 6 weeks later, because Dean Salvi asked, and Hal had run out of reasons to say no. It was a small room, 40 students from 4 different disciplines, a moderator from the non-verbal diplomacy faculty, a session on behavioral signaling across species lines. Hal sat at the front with Kova beside him, and he talked about what had happened in plain terms. What he had done, what he had not done, what she had responded to, what he thought it meant. "I didn't do anything deliberate," he said. "I sat down in a seat. I was injured and I didn't run from her, and she made a decision about that." Someone in the third row, a Scan student, compact, four-eyed, raised a hand. "What made you stay still when she approached?" Hal thought about it. "The list of things I could do was very short," he said, "and none of them seemed right." "Were you afraid?" "My shoulder hurt," Hal said. "I was mostly thinking about that." A few people laughed. Kova's ears shifted forward at the sound, not alarm, just attention. She had been in enough rooms by now to know that laughter was not a threat. "Fear makes people quiet," Hal said. "It doesn't build anything. She was not afraid of me and I was not performing calm for her. I was just there, hurt and still, and she decided that was worth something." He paused. "I think that's the part I can't fully explain. She chose. Nobody asked her to. Nobody designed her to. The calibration said one thing and she did something else, and the something else was to stay." The moderator was taking notes. Several students were taking notes. Kova had lowered her head onto her forelimbs and was watching the room with her gold eyes half closed, the specific expression she had developed in spaces where nothing was threatening and she did not need to be ready. Hal looked at her for a moment. "That's the only thing I know for certain," he said. "She chose to stay. Everything else is documentation." The Senate inquiry cleared the bond on a morning in late autumn, when the Academy's heating system was losing the argument with the outdoor temperature, and everyone in the building was wearing an extra layer. Hal found out from the dean, who had been notified before him and had the grace to walk to his room in person rather than sending a comm. She stood in the doorway, and she looked at Kova, and she said simply, "It's done." The inquiry had closed with a formal recognition of the bond, a Type 3 sentience designation that was now permanent and on record, and a brief statement from the committee chair that the case had raised questions about calibration ethics in enforcement science that the Senate intended to review. The Halley Protocol, named for the Academy, not for Hal, which he appreciated, established new procedures for behavioral assessment in bonded predator cases going forward. Voss did not contest the ruling. Hal had not expected him to. He walked to the rotunda that afternoon because it was the widest open space on campus, and Kova liked it. The high ceiling, the natural light from the dome, the room to move without walls close. He had started bringing her there in the evenings, a habit that had started as a practical matter and become something else. They crossed the rotunda together. It was busy midday, students between sessions, the low hum of a dozen species going about their ordinary academic lives. People stopped, not out of fear, or not only out of fear. Some of them had been in the Meridian Hall. Some of them had heard the story the way stories travel through closed campuses in versions that got things wrong in interesting ways. Some of them just looked. Hal kept walking. Kova moved beside him, unhurried, her head level, her gold eyes moving through the crowd with the calm attention of something that had stopped feeling like it needed to be ready for everything. He did not stop to talk. He did not explain himself to anyone. He walked, and she walked beside him, and the watching happened around them like weather. At the far end of the rotunda, there was a window bench, low and wide, where the dome light came straight down in the late morning. Hal sat on it. Kova settled beside him, her side warm against his leg, her head turned toward the room. The Senate inquiry was done. The documentation was filed. Tharn was gone. Voss was not coming back. He reached up with his right hand, the good arm, the one that had spent months as the default because the other one was occupied with healing, and rested it on Kova's neck. She pressed into the contact, a small, decided shift, her weight settling more fully into his side. The room moved around them, students crossing, conversations in a dozen frequencies, the ordinary noise of a place full of people going somewhere. Nobody approached. One or two people slowed down, looked, moved on. Hal tilted his head back and looked up through the dome at the pale sky. He had written the behavioral timeline on paper because his training instructor had told him to the first semester in a lesson about diplomatic archives. Any record you might need to prove existed should exist in a form no system can lock. He had not known then what he was writing toward. He knew now. Back in his room, the sling hung on the hook by his desk. The shoulder had been cleared weeks ago. The medtech had checked it 3 times, removed the immobilizer brace, signed off on full movement. He did not need the sling anymore. Every morning, before he was fully awake, Kova pressed her head against that shoulder first. Not the right one, not the easier one. The left, the one that had been hurt, the one she had learned to read, the one she had decided, early and without being asked, was the one that needed watching. She pressed her head there first, every morning, and held it until he moved. The light came through the dome, in a long, clean bar, across the rotunda floor. Kova's breathing was slow and even against his leg. She had chosen to stay. That was the only miracle that mattered.